Hi, and welcome to Psychology2. We're going to begin with Brain and Behavior in Chapter 2. Now, a 44-year-old man arrived at the hospital complaining of weakness in his left leg. A married man of 2 children, he currently works as a civil servant. As a child, he had been diagnosed with hydrocephalus. And that's a condition in which fluid remains in the brain and causes head swelling. And in order to treat the disorder, doctors had placed a drain in his head so that the excess fluid could flow into his stomach without impacting his brain. Without impacting brain development. His neurological development and medical history were otherwise normal until he returned to the hospital as an adult. The doctors decided to use an MRI to look at the man's brain, and what they saw astounded them. The man's brain had been almost entirely compressed by the buildup in fluid, yet the only symptom the man had showed was a bit of weakness in his left leg. So reducing the amount of fluid in the man's head reduced the pressure on what remained of his brain and relieved the weakness in his left leg. But it didn't change his massive amounts of fluid space in his brain. So how could this man live such a normal life with such a small amount of brain? Removing a complete amount, or comparable amount, if you can imagine this head here and his brain's basically on some aspect where the vast majority of his brain is fluid filled, or his head is fluid filled, and the brain is compressed down into a small amount. So if you removed a comparable amount of brain from an adult brain, it would be very likely result in death, or certainly would prevent him from maintaining any job or having a family. However, the human brain is remarkably flexible or plastic, particularly during development in your early years. Since the civil servant's brain was most likely compressed gradually during his development, it was able to adapt and function, for all intents and purposes, perfectly normal. So in this chapter, we're going to learn about the distinct structures of the brain, their respective functions, and how much, and much more, from neurons, the microscopic level, to the visible structures of the brain that provide the basis of functions such as memory, speech, sensation, thought, planning, voluntary movement. So everything we see everything we see, we do, we hear, we think, and feel is based on our biology. Neurons are the base component of what makes up our brain, and these cells perform 3 important tasks. So we're going to begin with neuron in terms of this chapter. All right? So let's look at those 3 basic important tasks. One is afferent or sensory neurons, and they relay messages from the sense organs and receptors, eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and skin, to the brain or the spinal cord. The efferent motor neurons, these convey signals from the brain and spinal cord to the glands and muscles enabling us to move. And then the third task are the intraneurons, thousands of times more numerous than sensory and motor neurons. They carry information between neurons in the brain and between neurons in the spinal cord. So when we consider neurons, we see that there's 3 key structures of neurons. And we're going to look at that. You'll see the image there. Now there's the cell body or the soma, dendrites, and axon. Now the cell body or the soma contains the nucleus and carries out the metabolic or life-sustaining functions of the neuron. So all that the neuron needs to be life-sustaining for itself is found in the cell body, the soma. Now the dendrites, these branch out from the cell body and are the primary receivers of signals from other neurons. So this is how neurons communicate with one another, is through their dendrites. They can relay messages backwards from the cell body to their own branches, and this is also known as back propagating. Now the axon is a slender tail-like extensions of the neurons that sprout into many branches, each ending in a round axon terminal. Now, the axon terminals transmit signals to the dendrites or cell bodies of other neurons, and to the muscles, glands, and other parts of the body. Now, there is an additional cell. They're known as glial cells. These are specialized cells that help the efficiency of the brain. They clean out the wastes, things like dead neurons, and they make the myelin coating for the axon, which is allowing it to function more successfully. Now, as neurons are not actually connected to one another physically, they don't join together in any sort of way like that. There's a synapse, and it's a junction point between the neuron at the axon terminal, and there are filled gaps between the two neurons at their axon terminal, and it's called a synaptic cleft. A synaptic cleft. So these two clefts are sort of like this with one another, and there's this space in between, and that's where the two communicate. This is the point of communication between the two neurons. So how do neurons communicate with each other? Well, there's a mechanism that enables this communication to occur as frequently as it does. So let's review the process of neuron communication, keeping in mind that this is essentially an electrical, not the same electricity that runs through your home, but is essentially an electrical component. Okay, so the action potential is the firing of a neuron that results when the charge within the neuron becomes more positive than the charge outside the cell's membrane. So when a neuron is at rest, it's not firing, it's not working at that point, the inside of the neuron has a slight negative electrical charge compared to the outside. This is referred to as the neuron's resting potential. So when a neuron is stimulated, more positively charged particles flow into the cell, making the inside suddenly more positively compared to the outside of the cell. This sudden reversal is the action potential. And immediately after the neuron fires, some positive particles are actively pumped out of the cell. The neuron returns to its resting potential and is ready to fire again if stimulated. Now, an important part of this process are what are known as neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are the chemical messages of the brain. What role do they play in the transmission of signals between the neurons? Well, let's explore that. When neurotransmitters enter receptor sites on the dendrites or cell bodies of receiving neurons, their action is neither excitatory, which influences the neurons to fire, nor are they inhibitory, influencing them not to fire. Although many other neurotransmitters have now been identified, we continue to think of acetylcholine as one of the most important neurotransmitters. Now, you might be familiar with the term curare, which is a poison that was discovered by South American Indians. They put it on the tips of darts. They'd shoot them through blowguns, and the curare, when it enters into the system of an animal, blocks the acetylcholine's receptors, paralyzing the internal organs is the result, and therefore the victim is unable to breathe and dies. Now, this is an inhibitory in effect. No kidding, eh? A substance in the venom of black widow spiders stimulates the release of acetylcholine at the synapse. Botulism, that's a toxin found in improperly canned foods, blocks release of acetylcholine at the synapse that has a deadly effect. And it takes less than 1/1,000,000th of a gram of this toxin to kill a person. A deficit of acetylcholine is associated with Alzheimer's disease, which affects a high percentage of older adults. So neurotransmitters are powerful. They can be very strong, and they have various roles that they can play. Now, many neurotransmitters have been identified since 1921, and there is increasingly evidence that their importance in human behavior. Psychoactive drugs affect consciousness because of their effects on the sympathetic transmission. For example, cocaine and the amphetamines prolong the action of certain neurotransmitter, and opiates imitate the action of natural neuromodulars called endorphins. So some of us maybe have had more awareness of the role of neurotransmitters without really knowing that they are neurotransmitters. This is an excitatory effect. It appears that neurotransmitters dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin are associated with some of the most severe forms of mental illness. When if you take the course Abnormal Psychology, we look at some of the roles of neurotransmitters on different diagnoses of psychological disorders. There are probably only a few ounces of these substances in our body, but they may have a profound effect on mood, memory, perception, and behavior. Could intelligence be primarily a matter of having plenty of the right neurotransmitters at the right synapses? Well, let's look at the following neurotransmitters. We're going to look at acetylcholine, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, serotonin, amino acids, and endorphins, all of which are neurotransmitters. And we'll sort of touch on each one and look at what the role is in our own motor activities or brain activities. Acetylcholine was the first to be discovered, and it's an excitatory neurotransmitter that causes your muscles to contract. It has an inhibitory effect on the muscle fibers of the heart, which keeps the heart from beating too fast. It's also playing a role in stimulating neurons involved in learning new information. Acetylcholine affects movement, learning, memory, and REM sleep. That's rapid eye movement sleep. It's a stage in our sleep cycle. An important class of neurotransmitters known as monoamines include 4 neurotransmitters: dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and serotonin. And we'll look at these individually as well. Like acetylcholine, dopamine produces both excitatory and inhibitory effects and is involved in several functions, including learning, attention, movement, and reinforcement. It's also important to our ability to feel pressure. Low levels of neurotransmitter dopamine have been found to cause Parkinson's disease, and increased levels of dopamine have been linked to psychological disorders known as schizophrenia. Dopamine affects learning, attention, movement, reinforcement. Now you're going to see a lot of overlap in these, but it also sort of shows the amount of role different neurotransmitters play in our everyday life of what goes on around us. Norepinephrine affects eating habits. It stimulates the intake of carbohydrates and plays a major role in alertness and wakefulness. Serotonin produces inhibitory effects at the most of its receptors, which informs at the synapse. It plays an important role in regulating mood, sleep, impulsivity, aggression, and appetite. It's also been linked to depression and anxiety disorders. Some antidepressant drugs relieve the symptoms of depression by blocking the uptake of serotonin or norepinephrine, thus increasing the neurotransmitter's availability in the synapse. Now, there are two types of amino acids of particular importance that are found more often than others in the central nervous system: glutamate and GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid. I'll refer to that as GABA in the future, just so it's simpler. Glutamate is a primary exciter transmitter in the brain. It's been released by 40% of neurons. It may be released by as many as 40% of the neurons, and is active in the higher brain centers that are involved in learning, thought, and emotions. Now, GABA, this is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. It is widely distributed throughout the central nervous system, brain, and the spinal cord, and it's thought to facilitate the control of anxiety in humans. Tranquilizers, barbiturates, and alcohol appear to have a calming and relaxing effect because they bind with and stimulate one type of GABA receptor and thus increase GABA's anxiety controlling effect. Endorphins, they're kind of like an opiate-like substance produced naturally by the brain that provide relief from pain or the stress of vigorous exercise and produce feelings of pleasure and well-being. Now, these are just a quick overview of our neurotransmitters, and what we will do now is we're going to do a quick review over our central nervous system, the CNS. It's the first the major structures and the major functions of those structures we'll look at. So the nervous system is divided into two parts. The first is the central nervous system, the CNS, which is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. The second is the peripheral nervous system, which connects the central nervous system to all other parts of the body. The central nervous system is composed of a spinal cord and the human brain. The spinal cord descends from the brain and transmits messages between the brain and the peripheral nervous system. The brainstem, the cerebellum, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus, the limbic system, and the cerebral hemispheres, the left and right, including the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. Now, all of these elements are important to make up our brain, which therefore makes up who we are and our ability to function completely. The brainstem, it contains the medulla, which controls the heartbeat, breathing, blood pressure, coughing, and swallowing. So these are things that we don't really think about, but it's an important aspect to our survival. And two, the reticular formation, also known as the reticular activating system, or RAS, which plays a role, and it's a crucial role, in arousal and attention. Now, arousal isn't just being excited, it's being awake and alert and being able to communicate and engage with the world around us. Now, the cerebellum, which means little cerebrum, the main function of the cerebellum are to execute smooth, skilled movements and to regulate muscle tone and posture. The thalamus, it acts as a relay station for virtually all information that flows into and out of the higher brain centers. The hypothalamus regulates hunger, thirst, sexual behavior, body temperature, a biological clock known as the circadian rhythm, and a variety of emotional behaviors. As small as it is, the hypothalamus maintains nearly all of our bodily functions except blood pressure, heart rhythm, and breathing. The limbic system is a group of structures deep within the brain, including the amygdala and the hippocampus, that are collectively involved in emotional expression, memory, and motivation. The amygdala helps us form associations between external events, including social ones, and the emotions related to those events. Our fear and fright and flight response come out of the amygdala. The hippocampus is absolutely essential for the formation of conscious memory. It also plays a role in the brain's internal representation of space in the form of neural maps that help us learn our way around the environment and remember where we have been. You know, being able to wake up in the morning, get dressed, have breakfast, grab a coffee, and step out of the house and know exactly where you are in space and time, and that you're going to Georgian College, so you know how to get there, is all responsible within our hippocampus. Now, the cerebral hemispheres are the right and left half of the cerebrum, connected by the corpus callosum, and it's covered by a cerebral cortex. Now, the corpus callosum is a band that joins these two halves. If you were to see a brain, they'd be two lobes, kind of like this, and that centerpiece that joins that's the corpus callosum, and are covered by a cerebral cortex, which is responsible for higher mental processes such as language, memory, and thinking. The frontal lobe contains the motor cortex, which contains voluntary motor activity. I moved my arm out like this, that was my cortex, the frontal lobe, sort of. and the Broca's area, which is number 2, which functions in speech production, and 3, the frontal association areas, which are involved in thinking, motivation, planning for the future, impulse control, and emotional responses. So that's an important function of the frontal lobe. When we get into the parietal lobe contains the somatosensory cortex, which is, where touch, pressure, temperature, and pain are registered, and other areas that are responsible for body awareness and spatial orientation. Now, the occipital lobes, they contain the primary visual cortex, where vision registers and association areas involved in interpretation of visual data. An area called Broca's area in the left frontal lobe is responsible for producing fluent, understandable speech. If it's damaged, the person has Broca aphasia, in which words will be halting and pronounced incorrectly. An area called Wernicke's area is in the left temporal lobe, and it's responsible for understanding language. If it's damaged, the person has Wernicke's aphasia, in which speech is fluent but nonsensical. The wrong words are used. Spatial neglect comes from the damage to the association areas on one side of the cortex, usually the right side. The person with this condition will ignore information from the opposite side of the body or the opposite side of the opposite visual field. So what are the functions of the left and right hemisphere? Well, the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body and coordinates complex movements, and in about 95% of the people. And it controls the production of speech and written language, whereas the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. And in most people is specialized for visual spatial perception and understanding nonverbal behavior. The research with split brain patients has expanded our knowledge of the unique capabilities of individual hemispheres. A split brain operation performed in severe cases of epilepsy is an operation in which the corpus callosum, that's that part in the middle, is cut, separating the two cerebral hemispheres, and usually lessens the severity and frequency of grand mal seizures. Now, that is only done in the most extreme cases. So that's part 1. It's a quick overview of looking at the brain parts and keeping us focused on that. We'll do the second part for this chapter will be in the same week 2 folder, okay? So here we go. Please take the time to watch the videos completely and to use your textbook in preparing for future tests. It'll make a huge difference for you. All right? So good luck, and we'll see you in part 2 in week 2. Sort of keeping it all on track. Bye, everybody.